Looks like YouTube is going to work.
Yay!
Patricia?
Yep.
I'm going to go ahead and put you on Spotlight.
Okay.
So that you can, or just be there when you decide to get started.
Alrighty. And I might go ahead and just turn on the webinar.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay. And that'll give people like a minute to. Good evening, everybody. If you're jumping on right now, we're going to start in just about 2 or 3 minutes at 6 o'clock. So we're looking forward to seeing everybody here in just a moment. I'm just thinking about the fact that a year ago this week is when we were going to have our preservation conversation at the paint factory, and we had to postpone it because of the coronavirus. So March of last year is when we, at the last minute, suspended that talk. I don't know if you remember that crazy day. Yeah. So it's been a crazy year for sure, but I'm glad that we can still meet this way and connect with everybody. We're going to get started in just a few seconds here. All right, it is 6 o'clock. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our March Preservation Conversation, Women's Suffrage in Central Arkansas, People and Places by Kathleen Pate. I'm Patricia Blick, the Executive Director of the Quapaw Quarter Association, and I'm joined by Shelley Stormo, our Membership and Events Coordinator. I'd like to thank our donors as well as our corporate and individual members. We are able to continue our educational programs with your support. You can find a list of our corporate members on our website at quapaw.com. If you're not a member of the QQA and you believe in our mission, preserving Greater Little Rock's historic places, we invite you to join and support the work that we do. Please go to quapaw.com to join for as little as $35 a year or to make a donation. If you join or donate at the $100 level, you can receive our Never, Never, Never Give Up t-shirt, which I'm wearing tonight. Model it for you. Or we have a few of our Keep Calm and Preserve On t-shirts still, if you make a donation or a membership of $100 or more. We'd love to have you join the QQA. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to remind you that we'll be taking your questions at the end of the talk. You can type your questions into the chat area of Zoom, or you can type them into the comment area if you're joining us on YouTube. On to tonight's preservation conversation. I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Kathleen Pate. Kathleen was born and reared in Augusta, Georgia. She has an undergraduate degree in sociology and a certificate in women's studies from the University of Georgia. Kathleen completed a thesis on the evolution of presidential library site selection to earn her master's degree in public history from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. She began her career in museum education at the Historic Arkansas Museum in 1998 and accepted her current position as the education specialist at the Clinton Presidential Library in 2002. Kathleen serves on the board for Girl Scout Diamonds of Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, and chairs the Diamonds Heritage Committee. She is the treasurer of the Arkansas Women's History Institute. For several years leading up to the centennial of the 19th Amendment in 2020, Kathleen served as the chair of the Arkansas Women's Suffrage Centennial Commemoration Committee. She also represented Arkansas on the Women's Vote Centennial Initiative Task Force and the National Votes for Women Trail Project. Kathleen lives in Pine Bluff with her husband, Matthew, and their rescue Boston Terrier, Tilly, whom we might have joining us tonight during the talk. I am very pleased to welcome Kathleen to tonight's preservation conversation.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here. And yes, Tilly is sitting in my lap. And if you were watching my screen a moment ago, she was climbing up on my arm, but I think she's gonna chill out and just hang out. She is very vocal if she thinks that I'm talking and not including her. So that's why she has to be in my lap. So I'm gonna share my screen and get started. I could talk all day about women's suffrage. Literally, I think I could talk probably 8 hours about women's suffrage, but I am in no way an expert. I am a suffrage enthusiast. So not just women's suffrage, but voting rights in general, and kind of looking at how the Constitution has been amended over time to expand and enhance voting rights. So I want to start out thinking about what you already know about women's suffrage. And I'm hoping that you're a little bit like I was, that you don't know that much from your early education. So who has seen, I think we've all seen Mary Poppins, and we see British suffragists or suffragettes there in Mary Poppins. And we probably learned about Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but most textbooks basically say Seneca Falls, 72 years, 19th Amendment. And we don't really understand what happened in that 72 years. So I want to talk about that. And as I move into this conversation, thinking about Mary Poppins and thinking about the suffrage movement in the United Kingdom, the women who were a part of the radical suffrage movement in the United Kingdom chose to identify as suffragettes. In the United States, the more radical women did not prefer that term. It's a more fun word, it's easier to say, but they preferred to be called suffragist. Right, so throughout my presentation, I will be using the word suffragist, even though it's a little bit harder to say. So my journey to learning about the 19th Amendment started many years ago. In 2012, we were actually lucky enough to have the 19th Amendment on display at the Clinton Presidential Library. So before it arrived, I did a lot of research, and I learned a lot about not just the movement nationally, but the movement here in Arkansas and the unique place that Arkansas holds in the history of the women's suffrage movement. We did a great program with Girl Scouts, so kind of combining some of my interest. And I just basically wanted to put this photo in the slideshow because it's probably one of the coolest programs I've ever done. So having these young women make pennants and banners and then march through the Cheese Dip Festival that was happening in the parking lot of the Clinton Library that day, way back, I guess, more than 8 years ago. All right, so as I mentioned, your textbook, your early education, even, history in college doesn't really focus on women's history, right? Unless you take a specific women's history class or women's studies class, you aren't necessarily going to dive into how the 19th Amendment came to be. So we think about the Declaration of Sentiments. We think about what happened in Seneca Falls in 1848. This is not the first time that women were demanding equal rights. And part of what's interesting about what happened in Seneca Falls is that voting rights, women's suffrage, doesn't come up until the very end. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton brings it up, and everyone, it's such a radical idea that people are like, oh, no. We can talk about women and property rights. We can talk about other issues related to women's rights, but to ask for the right to vote, to demand the right to vote, that's too much. That's too much. So it was actually, you're going to make me forget Frederick Douglass. It was actually Frederick Douglass who stood up. He was one of the very few men that was there. And he stood up and said, yes, voting rights should definitely be on a part of this Declaration of Sentiments. And the Declaration of Sentiments was meant to kind of be similar to the Declaration of Independence, right? So they wanted to make a declaration of all the ways that they thought women were not being treated equally. So this is way back, 1848. Interesting thing, Frederick Douglass was there and Susan B. Anthony was not there. Susan B. Anthony didn't meet Elizabeth Cady Stanton for several years. This is a sculpture in Seneca Falls. This is actually when they meet. And the woman who is introducing them is Amelia Bloomer. So when we think about those pants we wear under our dresses, it's a very antiquated term, but bloomers, that's Amelia Bloomer there wearing the pants underneath her dress, because that gives her a lot more freedom than wearing just a dress. All right, if you want to really dive into that, there's an excellent book called The Myth of Seneca Falls that really kind of, it's a deep dive into how Seneca Falls became kind of what we know about. And one of the interesting things we think about the winners, the victors. To the victors go the spoils, and the winners write history. Well, interesting thing, there were two kind of competing women's suffrage associations. And you'll notice I'm always saying women plural, but they prefer to use woman singular. So the National Women's Suffrage Association, which is Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and then the American Women's Suffrage Association. So these two organizations exist prior to the Civil War. And what happens to the women's suffrage movement during the Civil War is it's basically put on hold. On both sides, women are committed to the war effort. So they are not working on women's suffrage. And what happens after is that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony publish a book that will become the definitive history of the women's suffrage movement prior to the Civil War, and they put themselves at the center of that history. So they basically wrote themselves into being the early leaders of the women's suffrage movement. So we don't hear a lot about Lucy Stone because those two organizations merge in 1890, and that is being polite, right? So basically, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are able to assert their prominence in the history of the movement, and Lucy Stone is not able to raise the money for her organization to continue. And so you can see there in 1890, they eventually have 1,000 branches organized in 38 different states. So there are issues, most of the suffragists that we know about, even that limited number that we hear about or we learn about, we don't typically learn about African-American women who were a part of the women's suffrage movement, but they played a huge role. And they really asserted that race was an issue and called out suffrage organizations, right? This is Mary Church Terrell. She was a member of NASA, so that's that combined organization. Women of color were not allowed to hold leadership positions. So a lot of race-based discrimination is present in the women's suffrage movement. All right, even in the more radical National Woman's Party, we see issues of race. So NASA chose to, their strategy was a state-by-state campaign. So they were working with different state legislatures to try to get voting rights expanded to include women. And Alice Paul came along. She's a different generation. She's a much younger than Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who do not live to see the passage of the 19th Amendment. She's much younger. She's well educated. She's actually studied abroad. She's been to the United Kingdom. She's been a part of those more radical suffragette movements. And she comes to NASA and she says, you know, we need more visibility and we need to fight for a constitutional amendment, a federal amendment. And so one of the ways that she looks to get visibility is by hosting a parade the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. So that's March of 1913. This is before presidential inaugurations are changed to January 20th. And eventually, she breaks away from NASA and creates the National Woman's Party because their approaches are absolutely at odds with one another. And the National Woman's Party becomes the first organization to protest outside of the White House. It's very controversial, and even more so when the United States enters World War I. So it's one thing to picket the president. It is another thing to picket a wartime president. So I want to dive a little bit deeper. I do want to mention race was an issue even within the National Woman's Party. For the parade, Ida B. Wells was meant to be part of the Chicago delegation, and Alice Paul made a compromise with women who were coming up from southern states to participate. And the idea was that African-American women would march in the back. And Ida B. Wells said, I march with my delegation. I marched for the Illinois delegation. And so that's exactly what she did. During the parade, she stepped into the parade. She waited along the route, stepped into the parade, and joined the Illinois delegation. So that's Alice Paul on the left and Ida B. Wells on the right. And you might be thinking, oh, this is a great slide. I wasn't quite where I thought I was, but this is a great slide. I thought I'd moved it to the end. But these are, so we've got all of these different organizations that are fighting for women's suffrage, but we also have organizations that are fighting against women's suffrage. And one of the arguments that they're making is that if women get the right to vote, they will abandon their womanly duties. So we see a man here who is stuck, right, tending the children at night. His wife is off running the government. And then this other gentleman is not only stuck with the infant child, but also doing the wash. Everybody works but mother. She's a suffragette. So these are some anti-suffrage postcards that are in the Old State House Museum collection. All right, so Arkansas. Where does Arkansas fit in with this national movement? And so I'm going to talk about kind of the early movement in Arkansas and the later movement in Arkansas. And I'm going to use a term that's quite modern, but it's really good shorthand to convey. Arkansas holds a unique place in the history of the women's suffrage movement. So Arkansas was a little bit different than a lot of other southern states. So in early 1917, Arkansas becomes the first non-suffrage state to allow women to vote in primary elections. You'll see this photo again at the end of my presentation, but I want to point out the arrow there is pointing to Governor Brough, so part of the progressive movement. And then Arkansas becomes the 12th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And I'm particularly fond of this political cartoon. This was done by a woman named Nina Allender, who was an artist, mostly a painter, but she was recruited by Alice Paul to draw political cartoons for The Suffragist, which was the weekly publication of the National Woman's Party. So they had a fabulous banner in women's suffrage colors, and they sewed stripes on to represent each state as they ratified. So you can see the arrow pointing to Arkansas, a very happy young lady. They're about to sew that star on the banner. And what I love about this is Georgia is there in the back. She's holding a little piece of paper that says rejected. And you can see she's labeled Georgia. So she's off to the side. She's not invited to the party. So Arkansas is not only an early ratifier of the 19th Amendment, but ends up being one of the few southern states to do so. So if you can see the map in your head as I point, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, which is not really the South, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, all outright reject the 19th Amendment. So what is happening in Arkansas? Why is Arkansas, and I alluded that I was going to say this earlier and I didn't actually say it, I'm going to refer to Arkansas as a swing state when it comes to women's suffrage, right? So how does Arkansas end up being the 12th state to ratify and one of few southern states to do so? So the idea of women's suffrage in Arkansas came about pretty early on. So actually Miles Ledford Langley, he was from Arkadelphia, Clark County, and he was a representative to the Arkansas Constitutional Convention. And he proposed, so this is 1868, he proposed, and I'll quote it, all citizens 21 years of age who can read and write the English language shall be eligible to the elective franchise. And the Arkansas Gazette, Mr. Langley spoke earnestly, but his remarks elicited much laughter. So no one took him seriously. He later wrote a letter to Susan B. Anthony apologizing that they didn't really consider it. Did not give a guarantee to woman her God-given and well-earned rights of civil and political equality. So folks in Arkansas are thinking about this pretty early on, right? So we're looking at, Arkansas has to have a new constitution. It's post-Civil War, and it's proposed, but it's also laughed at. So we really see some traction with the women's suffrage movement. We start seeing women organizing around different causes. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union, depending on who you're reading, is created in 1873 or 1874, and it finds its way to Arkansas in 1879. And by 1888, the WCTU sees women's suffrage as the path to achieving prohibition, right? We're going to get rid of alcohol because we're going to get women to vote, and they're going to make this happen. All right, so we see some organizations that are being formed, and it gets pretty confusing pretty early on because they're not very creative with the names. In 1881, we see the Arkansas Women's Suffrage Association. This is Lizzie Dorman Flyer. She is up in Eureka Springs. And then a very similar name, but different organization in 1888 is the Arkansas Women's Suffrage Association, and that is Clara McDermott here in Central Arkansas. And then in 1888, we also see the Arkansas Equal Suffrage Association. So lots of different organizations that are being created kind of in the late 1800s. Clara McDermott, one of the teasers for tonight's talk was that someone in Arkansas had "I voted" stickers placed on her grave. And that is Clara McDermott. You're seeing here a picture of her, then also her home, and then her marker, which I believe is in Mount Holly Cemetery. And I love that the folks that did this actually know who it was. It was not me. But they did not put their stickers on her actual gravestone, which if you follow Susan B. Anthony's gravestone, people go and put their "I voted" stickers there, and it's actually an issue in the conservation of her headstone. The stickers, the adhesive, it's all bad. So I think they're working on that, being able to allow people to do that symbolically, but then to also protect her headstone. So women were getting the word out, they were forming organizations, and they were also creating publications. So we see the Arkansas Ladies Journal, which supported suffrage, and that was headquartered in downtown Little Rock. It ran from 1884 to 1888. No, actually, yeah, Arkansas Ladies Journal was 1884 to 1888. And then we see the Women's Chronicle, which supported both women's suffrage and temperance, right? So those two causes are linked. And that's Catherine Campbell, Mary Burt Brooks, and Harriet Holt Cahoon are the founders of the Women's Chronicle. And these two are out of the Old State House Museum collection as well. So another way that they tried to get their message out, communicating, I don't know if you would call this a political cartoon. It certainly has a political message. What a woman may be and yet not have the vote, what a man may have been and yet not lose the vote. So women were really making an argument that they were working, they were mothers, they were nurses, they were teachers, they worked in factories. They could be mayor, but they could not have the vote. And you could be a drunkard, a lunatic, a convict, unfit for service as a man and retain the vote. So they were absolutely getting the word out, but they were not getting a lot of traction. Now, going back to the idea of Arkansas being a swing state, Arkansas being open to supporting votes for women, Susan B. Anthony went on a national tour. She came to Little Rock. She also visited Helena and Fort Smith. So this is in 1889. But later in 1916, you can see that kind of the next generation of organizations. So Carrie Chapman Catt becomes the president of NASA. So that's that combined suffrage organization. She visits in 1916. And before she gets there, Alice Paul, who is the founder of the National Women's Party, comes earlier in 1916. And this was a tour across the United States to demand an amendment to the Constitution. And so the arrow there, the yellow arrow there, is pointing to Alice Paul with her colleagues from the National Women's Party, and they are on the steps of the old State House, now the old State House Museum. So it's significant that these leaders, national level leaders, are coming here to Arkansas. And these organizations are also getting support from organizations in Arkansas. So in 1911, we see the Political Equality League, which is created here in Little Rock. And the first president is Mary Fletcher. And then we see over the next 3 years, we see the Political Equality League expand across Arkansas, including chapters in Hot Springs, Pine Bluff, Augusta, Malvern, and Fayetteville. And then in 1917, we see the formation, again, not very creative with the names, Arkansas Women's Suffrage Association later changes its name. It's later known as the Equal Suffrage State Central Committee. And so these organizations are supporting the work of what was originally the Congressional Union. So this is when Alice Paul is a part of NASA. So before she breaks away, she's given the opportunity to run the Congressional Union or the Congressional Committee in DC to push for an amendment. And they are supporting that here in Arkansas. And what you see is you really see this shift of leadership to kind of young women, particularly in Arkansas. You see young women who've been educated on the East Coast. You see Mary Fletcher Drennan, you see Adolphine Fletcher Terry. So we often think of Adolphine Fletcher Terry with the Women's Emergency Committee, but she actually took a very active role in fighting for votes for women early on. We also see Florence Brown Cottonham, also known as Mrs. T.T. Cottonham. She is the president of the Arkansas Women's Suffrage Association. So it gets a little confusing because now, there's like 4 different organizations that share a name, but they exist in different time periods. But this is a photo of her from the newspaper. She's speaking on the steps of City Hall. So you see not only national leaders coming to Arkansas, but you see leaders in Arkansas supporting national causes. You see there was a woman from El Dorado who was a part of the National Women's Party protest in front of the White House. And I also want to point out that this is part of what makes it challenging to do research related to women's suffrage, because when you're looking for women leaders, oftentimes they are not referred to, they're referred to strictly by their husband's name. And so it can be hard to make sure that you're looking at the same person and understanding where this person fits. So not just the names of the organizations, but the names of the women themselves can make this kind of research challenging. The National Women's Party, Alice Paul, this is actually before it's called that, but they got some great publicity from that parade in 1913. And in 1914, they called for rallies to be held across all of the states. And so I love these pictures. Particularly the woman there in the doorway of the old State House with the banners and the ribbons. And we're assuming, these are obviously black and white photographs, that we're assuming that those banners are in the suffrage colors that you see of purple, white, and gold. Now, Alice Paul was really good at creating a spectacle, so things like this. But that wasn't their only way of communicating. We tend to think of protest songs as something that came about in the 60s, the modern civil rights movement, but they had their own songs for the suffrage movement, including this little ditty. She's good enough to be your baby's mother, and she's good enough to vote with you. This is actual sheet music with lyrics, part of the Old State House Museum collection. I can only imagine what it would have sounded like. There have been some organizations during the centennial of the 19th Amendment who kind of recorded some of these old songs that were used to promote the movement. So this gets us back to 1917. And so it's early 1917, and Arkansas, as I mentioned when I started, becomes the first non-suffrage state to allow women to vote in primary elections. So at the time, our governor was Charles Bruff, and he is part of the progressive movement. And you can see we've shifted, right? So the old State House Museum is no longer the current state capitol, right? The Arkansas State Capitol is now the seat, the current Arkansas State Capitol is now the seat of government. And I'm pointing at Bruff along with these other folks, largely ladies, although depending on where you look, largely ladies surrounding him, but then gentlemen to the left. So we're looking at the progressive era. We're looking at a lot of change, but Arkansas is always, well, I'm not sure how to say this. I don't want to insult anyone. I've only lived in Arkansas 25 years, and I'm a naturalized Arkansan by marriage. My husband, born and reared here in Jefferson County. But Arkansas is often a state of contradictions. So, you know, Bruff comes into office saying that he supports women having the right to vote, but we also see the Elaine massacre taking place during his administration. So Arkansas is progressive in some ways and not so in other ways. And I want to point out that that is a big hole in my presentation tonight, is that it's very challenging. It's challenging to find stuff on women's suffrage, but it's particularly challenging to find out about the work that African-American women and men were doing related to women's suffrage. Now, it's not strictly the progressive government that turns this around for not just for Arkansas, but for the passage of the 19th Amendment. I want to point out that there are really two things going on, right? So we see the actions of the National Women's Party, and they're very good at raising visibility of this issue. But as the United States enters the war, women are contributing significantly to the war effort. And eventually, this is what Woodrow Wilson says changes his mind. So in the fall of 1918, Woodrow Wilson addresses Congress in support of the 19th Amendment. And he says, we have made partners of women in this war. We need to make them partners at home. Now, I know that QQA has a great connection, kind of the origin related to the MacArthur Park Historic District. And I want to point out that the MacArthur Museum of Arkansas Military History, you might know they have a fabulous collection of World War I propaganda posters. And so in March of 2019, kind of in anticipation of the centennial of the 19th Amendment, I worked with Executive Director Stephen McAteer, and we created a temporary exhibit called Imagery and Irony, the battle for women's suffrage through the political cartoons of Nina Allender. So you saw the earlier Allender where Arkansas is holding up its star and be, you know, all excited to be added to the ratification banner. But one of the things that Allender did after the United States entered the war was to take imagery from World War I propaganda posters and use that to point out the irony of denying women the right to vote at home. And so this was weekly on the cover of The Suffragist, and you see the banners that the women are holding. We ask not pardon for ourselves, but justice for all American women. Democracy begins at home. And you see Uncle Sam here very sternly sending a doughboy who looks a lot like President Woodrow Wilson, go in the name of democracy. So mothers are sending sons to die in a fight for democracy, but they have no voice in their own government. So I want to point out that this exhibit was originally supposed to run through the end of 2020, but it has been extended because of the pandemic. The MacArthur Museum of Arkansas Military History is currently open to the public Tuesday through Saturday, 10 o'clock to 4 o'clock. And I think you probably know it's free to the public. So I want to go ahead and open the floor to questions. I know I've covered a lot of information. Arkansas has just, there's so much. And I want to, while we're waiting to see if there are any questions, I want to point out some really valuable resources. University of Arkansas Little Rock Center for Arkansas History and Culture created an online exhibit related to women's suffrage. There's a great timeline there that really does a good job of interweaving the national story and the Arkansas story, so you can kind of follow along. And then also there's a book that was put out by the Butler Center. Bernadette Cahill wrote a book about the women's suffrage movement in Central Arkansas. And it's organized geographically rather than chronologically. So it can be hard to follow, but it really lets you know about all of the activity, a lot of which was taking place on Markham and what we now call Clinton, and kind of that central downtown area. So the Marion Hotel, the Capitol Hotel. Carol Young, yes, of course, I would like your copy of your late 50s Brownie Scout Handbook. Absolutely. Since we've shifted a little off topic, I want to mention Girl Scouts has done a great job in commemorating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, and they've offered a special patch. I just happen to have some on my desk here. And we really, as an organization that grows girls of courage, confidence, and character, we want to say that Juliet Gordon Lowe, the founder of Girl Scouts, was a supporter of women's suffrage. Girl Scouts was founded in 1912, so a full 8 years before women have the right to vote. But Juliet Gordon Lowe said, and this is a tradition that continues, Girl Scouts was not meant to be a political organization. And so she would not come out publicly in support of the women's suffrage movement. But when you look at Girl Scout handbooks from the early 19-teens, they're already including information about women's voting rights. And this is what you do. This is how you vote. This is why you need to vote. So coming out early with that, even though they didn't make a public stance on women's voting rights. What was a significant event here in Arkansas after women voting was approved here? Interesting thing, I do want to mention that primary suffrage in 1917 might not sound like a big deal, but we know that 40,000 women voted in the Arkansas primary in 1918, and they're supporting candidates who will then in turn be a part of Arkansas becoming the 12th state to ratify. So primary suffrage doesn't sound like a big deal, but it actually sets up that later success. Now, those 40,000 women voted in the Democratic primary in 1918 because we really weren't a two-party state at that point. And, I think I got a text. Can you say more about the Terry ladies? Was the support for the amendment strong in all parts of the state? We do see suffrage organizations forming and meetings taking place across the state. So I mentioned earlier, the metropolis of Malvern and Augusta, Arkansas. So this was not limited to Central Arkansas. We know that when Susan B. Anthony came to visit, that she went to Fort Smith and she went to Helena. There was a huge meeting thinking about African American women. The Prince Hall Masons, so that's the African American Masons headquarters, is still here in Little Rock, but they built their headquarters building in 1902, and in 1919 there was a meeting of over 400 members of the Order of the Eastern Star, which is women who are part of the Prince Hall Masons. And there was a report in the Pine Bluff commercial that, the Grand Master Mason spoke to them and really kind of echoed that sentiment that I attributed to Wilson earlier, echoed that idea that women had been a part of the war effort, a full partner in the war effort, and that absolutely supported, that the Masons supported women's suffrage. Now, the Terry ladies are an interesting story, because if you go back, it's Mary who is initially the president of the Political Equality League, but she gets married and she is not quite as active. And that's when Adolphine Fletcher Terry kind of steps up and kind of takes on some leadership roles in the Political Equality League. All right, so I'm not certain that I've answered those questions, but I think I've answered them to the best of my ability. In addition to the resource I mentioned, the University of Arkansas at Little Rock Center for Arkansas History and Culture website, the Encyclopedia of Arkansas also has some great information. They've got kind of a summary of women's suffrage. And what I love about the EOA is they've got all of the links in there, so you can always click and learn more about a particular person or a particular organization. All right, I was really worried that I was going to talk too long, so I limited myself to 30 slides. I apologize. I could have put some more in there.
No, I think this has been great, Kathleen. And let's give Shelley a moment to see if she's had any questions come in on YouTube as well, or in another avenue. Like I got the text a minute ago.
No questions on YouTube or through text.
Oh,
okay. Excellent. Yeah, and I pulled a lot of these images from the UALR virtual exhibit, and then also from the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. And I have to give credit to Georgianne Cisco at the Old State House Museum. They've got an awesome collection, some of which they've had on display during the centennial. And they have a living history actor who portrays Adolphine Fletcher Terry. So that's a really neat thing to see. So I want to mention on the national level related to the centennial, there is an organization called the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites. And they, working with a number of other women's history organizations, created the Votes for Women Trail. And so you may be familiar with the Pomeroy Foundation. They're known for sponsoring different kinds of historic markers. And so we have 4 sites in Arkansas that have been nominated to have markers. One is the Old State House Museum. One is the McDermott House that we saw earlier. And then the Masonic Hall that I mentioned here in Pine Bluff. And then also Mamie Yosenberger is out of Fort Smith. She's an African-American woman, very involved in the women's suffrage movement. And there will be if these are accepted, there will be a marker for her work in Fort Smith. Was this ratified by the Arkansas legislature? Yes.
And where is the McDermott House? What is the address?
You know, I should know that from the nomination, and I bet I can look it up because I pulled that. Right. So the question about was this ratified by the Arkansas legislature? So the 19th Amendment was ratified by the Arkansas legislature July 28th of 1919. So the 19th Amendment it's passed by the U.S. House several times before, and the Senate rejects it. So in May of 1919, we see the U.S. House pass it again. The Senate passes it on June 4th. And it's really a flurry of activity, and different states claim to be the first to ratify the 19th Amendment. It's a huge deal that Arkansas is, Governor Bruff calls a special session and has legislators return to the Capitol, a special session, and it's ratified by an overwhelming majority. And I mentioned that this was kind of different from most Southern states, not all. So Texas is actually the 10th to ratify. And then we see, you might be familiar with the story of Tennessee being the 36th state to ratify. So you need 3/4 of the states. And at the time, we had 48. So we needed 36 states to ratify. I'm checking on that address for you. It is at 1421 Center Street.
So here in Little Rock.
I'm sorry, 1424. I don't know why I said 21. In Little Rock. Yes, absolutely. In Little Rock. Yeah, and I mentioned the book by Bernadette Cahill. It is Arkansas Women and the Right to Vote. The Little Rock Campaigns, 1868 to 1920.
Well, this has been a wonderful presentation, and I am intrigued by the fact that you had competing factions, just like anything else political, that there were those that sort of wanted to sit back and be polite, and those that came through and said, it's just not going to happen. We've got to be a little bit more radical and forceful, and I'm amazed. Again, as you said, thrilled, of course, that Arkansas was a part of it, critical part. It's just quite intriguing as well.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting to see the national involvement with what was happening in Arkansas, and then Arkansas's involvement with what was happening nationally, and kind of watching that play out. And certainly, one of the things, if you may have noticed on the first slide, one of the things that I have learned over the course of the last couple of years being involved with the centennial commemoration, both statewide and then nationally, is that we can't say that we're celebrating 100 years of women's suffrage, because we know that the 19th Amendment was not applied equally. We know that African American women were still not able to vote. We know that Native American women were still not able to vote. And we know that that takes a long time. And so, sometimes a single word matters. And in this case, we are commemorating the centennial of the 19th Amendment rather than celebrating 100 years of women having the right to vote.
That's a very good point. And I mean, I have to be honest with you, hoping that I wasn't on screen when you were telling the Ida B. Wells story. I mean, that's heartbreaking, but I'm pleased that she did not follow that direction and marched with her contention from Chicago. I mean, it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, well, and we don't want to. There's a great film I highly recommend about the National Women's Party called Iron Jawed Angels, and in the film, it's depicted. Alice Paul is depicted as saying, it's kind of giving her a knowing nod, a kind of nod of approval. And the reality is that probably didn't happen. It probably didn't happen like that. And, one of the arguments against women being allowed to vote was that they weren't built to be political. They weren't smart, and they were too pure to be involved in politics. And if you look at the women's suffrage movement, you look at their strategies, very clever, very smart, using every avenue. And unfortunately, one of those avenues was to kind of stir up ideas about African American votes. So they weren't above using that strategy, particularly in the South, to say, if you give white women the right to vote, it'll cancel out the African American male vote. And it wasn't strictly limited to race. I think it was Carrie Chapman Catt. It might have been Anna Howard Shaw. There was a great article in Smithsonian Magazine a couple of years ago. Great is probably not the word to use, but in the Midwest, people were encouraged to give women the right to vote because their German immigrant neighbors didn't understand democracy. So unfortunately, women were all too ready to get down and dirty political, to do whatever they had to take to get the right to vote.
So they were politically prepared, so to speak. I mean,
absolutely.
They played the same game that everybody else was playing, and almost had to. Well, I appreciate your presentation, and am pleased to learn more. And again, thank you very much, Kathleen. It was good to connect with you tonight. Thank you for doing this. Our program on the anniversary of our moving to a virtual platform. So, and look forward to obviously continuing to work with you. I'm going to go ahead and close us up here. So let me share my screen again. And we're getting just nice comments about everyone's enjoyed the talk and the images and everything. So it's been
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Yes. And I'll just remind everyone that these are all available on YouTube. So all of the programs that we have had are available on our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and Google Quapaw Quarter Association, you can watch them to your heart's content, and you can share them. So don't hesitate to do that. So again, I just want to say thank you very much, Kathleen, for the presentation, and remind everybody that we are going to have another presentation in April, second Thursday of the month. It'll be Thursday, April 8th, and it'll be Dr. Andrew Beaupre. He is going to present Archaeology in Your Own Backyard, Discoveries at the Doty McAlpine House, which is on Center Street. And I think it's 1918 Center Street. I have to double check that address, but it is a lovely cottage, and right here in the heart of Little Rock, where he has done some investigating in his home. So that should be a great presentation. And then that's it for tonight. So thank you all very much. If you have questions, just reach out to us. We have very much enjoyed seeing everyone tonight. Thank you for coming. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Bye, Tilly.
Bye.